He served in the Navy, and then afterwards on the GI Bill attended the California School of Fine Arts from 1947 to 1951. He absorbs the tenets here, I think we could readily see, of Clyfford Still. You have an aggressive application of paint. You have no figurative references. The mass, the form, the paint sort of comes together as these sort of like areas of thick density and mass. It's kind of layered, but certainly not done in any kind of gentle fashion. It's rather done with a kind of strong, not necessarily abrupt, but strong stroke, strong application, the use of the arm. In this painting, we don't really have anything to hang on to. So we're forced to deal with the painting. By hang on to, we don't have any in. He's not giving us a little bit of form or something that we can go, oh, I can generate some kind of content out of that. We're just confronted with really what I see as almost like a wall. It's like you're looking at a kind of granite wall, and you have to deal with that granite wall. And in dealing with that granite wall, one has to think about oneself and sort of the larger drama of human existence. And this is exactly what he wanted. He wanted paintings that made us think about ourselves and the larger cosmic order. But not everybody's happy with this. Okay. Some at the California School of Fine Arts thought abstract expressionism was formulaic. That is, once you understood how to do it, you could do it by rote. It wasn't really that challenging. Among those was David Park, who in 1949 gathered his abstract expressionist paintings and destroyed them. He then turned to paint figurative work, which he continued to do, as we see here in this work from 1960. So this is this is like the end of his 10-year project, and he dies shortly after this. So when he first showed these, many of his peers were shocked. To them, this represented a return to nature, a conservative retreat to a familiar figural tradition. And in a simplistic way, one could say that he was. He was applying the bold handling of paint that was part of abstract expressionism to something, in this case, the figure from the real world. But one could argue that the figure is also part of a much longer Euro-American artistic tradition, and it was also something that one sees. So what he was doing was not necessarily returning to something that was regressive, but we're actually tapping into a longer and deeper artistic history. So in many ways, he is absorbing this tenets of abstract expressionism, and then if you want to think about it, he's modifying them by thinking back to even a longer history of making art in which the figure plays such an important part going back to antiquity. He wanted to be new, but he didn't want to destroy everything, and he felt that abstract expressionism was sort of wiping away too much. He's quoted as saying, "I believe that we are living at a time that overemphasizes the need of newness," wow, still today, "and of furthering concepts." Okay, so his goal was to render the world outside, not just inside. And so this is also interesting to think about the way that he is not really willing to give up the very nature of vision. One might say that one of the key things an artist actually does is look. He or she might make, but the looking is such an important part. And the translation of looking, however you might modify it, onto a surface or into a sculptural form is really the foundation of what many artists do. So in this painting, we see him representing mass and volume in such a way as to combine both the optical and the haptic. That he wants to give us the sense that we're looking at a figure, but he also wants to give us some sense of the palpability of that figure, that it's actually something that occupies real space, has real mass and volume. And we might also say that his emphasis on the gestural brushstroke and his use of unusual colors is a way in which this nude, this image, this view of the nude has been filtered through his own subjectivity. That is, he has produced it. He has not given up his role in the creation of this work. He's not succumbed to purely vision. Now, one might attribute this rejection of New York-based art. And interestingly, Briggs, so this is about, Briggs works in San Francisco and then about 1953 moves to New York. So his attitude or perception was that in order to become successful as an abstract expressionist, he couldn't stay in San Francisco, but in fact had to go to New York. And he was not the only one from the Bay Area to do so. Those who stayed, many of them rejected abstract expressionism and turned to either the figure or, in case of Bischoff and Diebenkorn, landscapes as well. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon, this rejection of this Eastern aesthetic. And I would suggest that in part this has to do with the myth of the West. The myth of the West in California was a place that you come to go to reinvent yourself and to free yourself of any strings that were attached to those things that you brought from the West, or to reject those things that you had in the West, to reinvent yourself. The other thing I would suggest here is in the 1950s is that we have a growing culture of nonconformity. And this also might fit into both California and the myth of the West. We don't need to conform to values that come from elsewhere. So Park is able to reject this in part because I think the kind of cultural attitude of the period helps him do so. While artists took their cues from the East, others took them from the West, specifically Asian art. Now, we find this most prominent in the arts and crafts movement. And here I'm showing you William Rice block print from the recent exhibit. California artists who took an interest in Japanese aesthetic and a Japanese aesthetic did so because it offered an alternative to the modernism promoted by Paris and New York. Ironically, however, the interest in the West came by way of the East. Now, the arts and crafts, of which Rice's prints are most often associated, rightly so, had its origins in England. It was a reform movement aimed at correcting the deleterious effects of industrialization as they played out on both the products that were made, which were considered shoddy in design and quality, as well as the alienation of labor that came with it. These ideas were brought to the US and are most often associated with the decorative arts and furniture, less so two-dimensional objects, but Rice certainly fits in, and also if you go upstairs, the Piazzoni, I think, also fits in this aesthetic as well. At the core of the arts and crafts philosophy lay the idea that work should be creative and joyful. It should be the essence of daily life. Work should not be just a mere act one pursues for sustenance. That is, you should work for the joy of it. And kind of not surprisingly, or correspondingly, the arts and crafts movement emphasizes the handicraft over the machine. It was believed that beautifully made, handcrafted objects would have a positive effect on people who lived with such objects. And in part, this explains why there's such a great emphasis on furniture, the decorative arts, and even architecture. This is just a series, just to remind you of stick-leaf furniture, arts and crafts aesthetic. Okay, so here we are. We have to go back, actually, to 1876 to begin to see, the interest among Americans in Japanese art. The centennial of 1876 was like a World's Fair. There were objects on display from around the world. Different countries had been invited. And of course, there were the celebrations of the United States' 100-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But of particular interest was the Japanese pavilion, and I show you that here. And here it's actually called a bazaar. The country had been opened in 1853 and had been invited by the US to exhibit at the centennial. Japan's goal was commercial in coming. Although anxious for recognition, it was more determined to make sales and export goods. Accordingly, the government encouraged artisans and manufacturers in Japan to produce exhibition-quality items. Now, those shown, and I don't really have a photograph of how they were displayed, but primarily we're looking at pottery. Ceramics is the primary thing that's taken note of at the centennial. It's taken note, it's of interest to reformers. And they're keen on these objects because they offer an alternative aesthetic to what then prevails. And that would really be the illusionistic tradition, or increasingly we're seeing Impressionism emerge. This aesthetic the Japanese art was also appealing because it was imagined to be created in small workshop conditions by artisans who carefully crafted their objects and really loved the things that they made. And this fit well into the arts and crafts ideology. Now, in the context of two-dimensional objects, two-dimensional things, it's Japanese woodblock prints that capture the attention of artists. This happens in the 1880s and especially into the 1890s, when a handful of American artists and scholars discover these works with great deal of kind of interest, close scrutiny, collecting. And this primarily happens first back east, but is also people are aware of it here in the Bay Area. So what do these prints offer? I'm showing you this Hiroshige print. And I think that just looking at it and keeping in mind, if you'd only seen works like Thomas Hill's illusionistic painting, this would seem very radical in its configuration of how to put a picture together. You see that there's large areas of open space. You have a very unusual composition with things set off to the side. You even have these kind of clouds that seem to be cropped. Actually, the spatial configuration seems quite unclear. It's not clear if you try to map it out exactly how it's working. But at the same time, I think it's created in such a way that one doesn't really mind that it doesn't sort of fit together perfectly, because it's a great experience looking at it. It's fun to look at these. You might also think about the interplay of light and dark with respect to the colors, and also the different uses of different qualities of line to get us to read each of the parts of the landscape slightly differently, and also even the kind of curving nature, the repeated curves that we find in this composition. So these prints, and prints like this, offered an alternative to existing Western conventions. Now, the man who promotes this is Arthur Wesley Dow. Dow is among the most important proponents of the aesthetic of Japanese woodblock prints. Now, he actually was European trained. He stops painting and takes up woodblock printing. So he just not only collects and looks, but he actually becomes a practitioner. He publishes a hugely important book, this book called Composition. You can easily find PDF versions of this online if you look for them. He became an educator. He worked at Columbia University's Teachers College. And so he wrote this book in part to help reconfigure school curriculum, revise school curriculums, so that the teaching of art was done in such a way as to actually help the students learn design principles that would have them make beautiful objects that would then in some ways actually correspond to the arts and crafts aesthetic, although he never really, I think, openly says that he's a proponent of the arts and crafts. He does align with that in many ways. So what Japanese prints teach, let me just go back here just for a sec. What Japanese prints teach Western artists, including Dow, is that some elements of the composition did not have to refer to the world seen, but could be used in purely formal ways to create a composition that was of interest on its own terms. In this mode, all parts of an image work together, line, color, pattern, shape, in order to create the finished whole. For Dow, composition, and here I show you a print by him. So this is an example of his print making. You can kind of, even if you know the kind of traditional still lifes, how this is a little fragment here of something that previously we would have wanted to have the whole thing put on view for us. For Dow, composition was the foundation of human and artistic activity. And the title page, he uses the word, the Greek word here for synthesis, implying a congruence of form and content. That is, a pictorial composition was not an assemblage of objects or a record of things seen by the human eye, but a harmonious interrelationship of forms that together would express an idea, something greater than the parts. Significantly then, Dow gave deliberate form and structure priority over descriptive natural content. The idea comes first, then observation, or the structure comes first. Here I give you just 2 pages to give you a sense of what you would find in Dow's composition. On the left, he offers an illustration of how changing the proportions of, if you will, the image or the frame would in fact change the feeling that one got from the landscape that was being pictured. He actually says to the artist, you should manipulate the size of your compositions in order to get the desired effect. You are not beholden to any kind of standardized format. And you might even think about that with respect to, this is really what we would call portrait format, thanks to Hewlett-Packard and everybody who tells us that, right? But this is actually a landscape as a portrait format. So he's sort of undermining convention. And on the far side, what you see is him changing different areas of light and dark on the same composition, again to get different effects, a different reading of the landscape. What he wants is the student to overlook the surface qualities of things seen, the texture, the play of light and shadow. This was a tenet of illusionism and impressionism. Instead, he wanted the artist to focus on composition and attend to three interrelated elements: line, areas of light and dark, and then color. It is from these elements the artist constructs a picture, massaging them in such a way as to not just give an image of his subject, not just a visual representation, but a visual representation that, not just a visual representation that documented a place, but an expression that somehow, a representation that somehow expressed something deeper, something that was more fundamental, an experience that was more than just something seen. And I think we can see that if we return to Rice's prints. Now, Rice's prints I thought were really interesting in many ways. First about Rice. Rice was an art teacher. He's first trained as an illustrator, then he becomes an art teacher, and he taught art according to Dow's precepts. And in fact, he had Dow in his library. He took up block printing inspired by Japanese prints that he saw, and no doubt because he was already aware of Dow's views. Now, what we see here is really a synthesis of elements that give us a reading of this place without actually being there. Now, if I asked you, how many of you have been to the coast and seen this? Most of you would say yes, right? But you haven't actually seen this particular one. And so there's something incredibly kind of wonderful about this in an effort to make a kind of universal experience. It's not specific, but yet we can all recognize it having somehow been there or been pretty close to the coast. And he does that, I think, in part by exploiting the kind of interesting, the use of line here to give us a certain visual read, the repetition here of pattern, of structural similarities in the composition of these diagonals. You might even note here the kind of way that he uses flat areas of color to create a sense of recession and also ambiguity, because it's not really clear. Are we looking at an inlet? What is this tree in the distance, or is the curved coast, is this like a cliff or something? And actually the other thing I would say about these kind of arts and crafts prints is that what I noticed is they actually begin to structure one's experience of the real world. So once I looked at a series of his prints that had live oaks, then I was on a walk and I'm like, oh, that's the same kind of craggy live oak, right? So there is a kind of interesting way they dialogue with each other. So Rice's work takes its inspiration from an Asian aesthetic, and in many ways celebrates, again, California landscape and the kind of natural experience one could have here in an ideal sense. But we also have artists who look to the south. This is Javier Viramontes' Boycott Grapes from 1973. This is a bold graphic work with an Aztec warrior clutching grapes that are dripping juice over the text that informs us what we should be doing. So this is a part of the Chicano Poster movement. And this was actually, I believe, in the Latin show that came from the Smithsonian that was here. Chicano Poster Art begins in 1965 with the production of graphic work for the United Farm Workers organizing and boycotting efforts. Now, labor conflict was not new to the 1960s, but what was different was that Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers challenged agribusiness and won. Moreover, a number of urban workers supported the strike, and thus a labor movement became a civil rights movement, what is known as the Chicano movement. Posters became part and parcel of this effort. While this movement initially grew out of an alliance in the 1960s of farm workers struggling to unionize in California and Texas, it came to include disenfranchised and dispossessed land grant owners in New Mexico, the urban working classes of the South and Midwest, and the growing student movement. Now, this art as political protest, and if we want to maintain a sort of Southern orientation, has its roots, we might say. There's many places we could look, but one of them, I think one powerful example, would be Diego Rivera. And this is an example of his work from the Detroit Institute. Diego had come to San Francisco in the 1920s and painted a number of murals here, although they don't necessarily have the same kind of strong kind of politics that we see elsewhere here. If you notice, Diego's politics are on view with a little, he has the red star there suggesting his socialist affiliation. Now, Rivera welded European modernism, Renaissance fresco painting, and pre-Columbian wall painting in order to make an art that spoke to the people of Mexico, or wherever he was painting, not the elites. That is, art as a tool of social and even revolutionary change. Chicano posters are a continuation of that tradition, but we might even say they're a more dramatic and aggressive form of political activism. In the early period, youth and students developed a cultural nationalist philosophy that was separatist in nature. It called for a reclamation and control of land stolen from Mexico, anti-Europeanism, and an insistence on the importance and glory of brown-skinned Indian heritage. So this is that moment, rather than to adhere to values of assimilation, this is to assert one's cultural heritage as equal to that of everyone else. It sought to achieve solidarity, and this is one of the things the posters sought to do, at least one half of what it seeks to do. It sought to achieve solidarity among Chicanos by drawing on deeply shared past that transcended economic or class status. This poster achieves a sense of community by appealing to the viewer's sense of his or her historical roots in pre-Columbian native populations. And I'm comparing it here to this actually exists, this Aztec calendar stone, but the photograph doesn't nearly work, I think, as well to sort of help give us a sense of where this imagery is coming from. It's borrowing from this Aztec form of very kind of flat representation with a face in the middle, and then we have this kind of the spoke-like forms coming out of it. It's much more simplified and made more dramatic by Viramontes. The suitability of the Aztec warrior to convey this message, identified by his headdress, stemmed from the belief that many Chicanos claimed they were descendants of the elite rulers of the Aztecs and Mayans, all who came from Aztlan, located, according to many, in the American Southwest. Indigenism, oh, forget it. Indigenismo, wow, that's really hard to say. This desire to self-assert one's indigenousness sought to establish links between Chicanos and their pre-conquest Mexican ancestors. So here is a way to actually bring forth a history and bring forth a history for political purposes. It was believed that reintroducing indigenous knowledge through literature, religion, and philosophy, principles would be established to create better, healthier, and wiser communities. But if that's the kind of community building project of this work, it also is working to counter dominant stereotypes, to actually encourage those who may not be entirely sympathetic with the boycott effort to take heed of this necessity to stop purchasing grapes because of the threat of a kind of militancy. And also the counter of the stereotype. Here I show you Speedy Gonzales from Looney Tunes. You might also think of the Frito-Lay Bandito, who was also a rather horrible caricature of Mexicans or Mexicans-Americans. So the message of this work is clearly political, and interestingly enough, it was not intended for museums. These works have since been collected and displayed, and we could actually say they're kind of a form of visual culture at first, and then became an art form, though of course clearly they have an artistic sensibility. Now, my fourth point of view My fourth compass point is where I kind of get stuck. Okay. So it seems, and here I'm using George Herms' Pandora's Box as my example, it seems that more recent artists don't necessarily look far for inspiration. They seem to look more locally. And in the case of Herms, he's not looking really in any geographic direction per se. He seems to be looking down at the ground, finding things on the ground and lifting them up to become art. And although Herms' work is dated to 1992, he established this mode of art making in the late 1950s and is often identified as a beat artist. Herms worked in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the context of the beat poets who rejected literary traditions and norms. So we can see this as a rejection of all kinds of norms, pictorial, sculptural, narrative. The beats also emphasized spontaneity and associational meaning rather than anything that was literal. Herms' works reject standard notions of what is and is not a sculpture. Indeed, the material, the lack of pedestal or whatever, lack of pedestal are good clues. This work does not appear to be crafted, but assembled from already existing objects that he has collected, as it turns out, at the dump. In part, Herms is looking back to an earlier history, or his move is validated by an earlier history. And this is Marcel Duchamp's Fountain from 1917. So Duchamp shows this as an exhibit in New York in 1917. He submits it to a jury-free exhibit. He submits it anonymously. The jury meets when they see this in the back room, much to their horror, because they had said anybody who paid would have their work actually put on view. So this meeting takes place, and there's a discussion. Well, we said that we, in fact, would allow anything to happen, but if we show this, and this is 1917, we are going to look really, really bad. And keep in mind, in New York at this time, there's a huge art press that would cover this event. It turns out that Duchamp is on the board of this gallery that's been organized. And he resigns when they decide that they are going to reject the work. And it turns out that he, in fact, had been the one who submitted it anonymously under the name of R. Mutt. So really, this is a kind of art thought piece rather than an aesthetic object per se. In fact, the original is destroyed, but I think SF MoMA and other museums actually have copies, which is super fascinating in itself because it's an anti-art gesture that then becomes part of the art world. But what's important for Duchamp is that he set in motion a number of ideas. And maybe it's Duchamp that undermines ultimately my idea that one could look at these sort of different compass points as ways to thinking about California artists being in a place and having purview of pretty much the entire world. Duchamp says that anything can be art if the artist claims it to be. He really didn't like the fact that patrons, critics, and collectors were the ones who called the shots. He was the artist. Shouldn't he get to say what it is? And so this is his kind of gesture towards that. And if you think about the history of late 20th century art, you can certainly see where this plays itself out as artists propose things that seem completely unartistic, and then they are accepted as art through the mechanism of the art world. Of course, you have to have the credentials to be an artist in order to pull this off. Secondly, he proposes that art is not about skill, or at least traditionally defined skill. It's not about the hand, but rather about the intellect. The artist should create works that stimulate intellectual thought, in a sense, a dialogue between the object and its viewers, and even between the object and viewers and other viewers talking to each other. Thirdly, Duchamp thought art did not have to be so serious. It could have punning quality, it could be fun, it didn't need to be all serious and transcendent. And then fourth thing, he thought that art should be about life. And this sort of relates to the third one, in that life is weird, paradoxical, confusing, funny, and in many ways, maybe art should be the same thing. So Duchamp opened the door for artists to use anything and everything as a source material, and to disregard any specific aesthetics, wherever they came from. It didn't have to be, north, south, east, west, or south. It could be really just down at the local plumbing store is where you might find your aesthetics. Going back to Herms, though, I think we can see his work, though, as a response to, again, the world around him, not looking far, but looking closely to the consumer boom that defined the second half of the 20th century. Remember, the post-war period is a period of great prosperity, but that prosperity is in part defined through the production of consumer goods, cars, shirts, Ritz crackers, that are available for us all. The challenge of Herms' work is that it does not lend itself to closure in terms of meaning. It's kind of a thought piece, but also, is it a painting? Sculpture? Relief? Is it representational? Is it abstract? Is it beautiful or is it ugly? Here I feel like, I don't know the answer, but let me ask you some questions and we'll talk about this. But I think it wants all those questions to be asked. That's exactly its point. We might also think about the title, Pandora's Box. The box was actually a jar, but nonetheless we think of it as a box, given to Pandora, which contained all the evils of the world. Okay? So there is a sense that he's commenting perhaps on consumerism and the fate of our world, and a kind of lamenting, actually, a melancholy of consumerism in respect to the waste that it produces. And you notice also that much of what he includes is not only thrown out, but actually rather old, if you will, almost kind of analog. And so I see this as also kind of a sadness that one has when, for example, visiting a junk store or even a kind of dump, which we don't really have anymore. But like these photographs who we don't know, they have been completely dissociated from the original context. And so their memory, as memory devices, they no longer function as they should. And there's something sad about the kind of discarding of materials that are so intimately associated with human existence. But then I might also just be getting older. Okay. But I think Herms is a good place to end, perhaps, because I think he also, for me at least, suggests a melancholy for the analog world. The kind of proliferation of digital culture through our phones and computers seems to make it so that artists can choose absolutely anything and everything as subject matter and be able to post it, not in a gallery necessarily, but in a online YouTube or their own gallery site. So with that in mind, like I said, what I thought this would be was, what I tried to do here was to give you a sense of this kind of alternative way of thinking of California art. I'm not really certain that it totally works. I think parts of it are interesting, but as far as kind of like an overarching framework, the chronology still has to somehow come into play. So I think that is the tension here between this desire to sort of do something new and then the kind of weight of chronology as a kind of way that seems to be so much a kind of default for us. So on that comment, I am finished. So if you have